You have to understand something most people miss about empaths: they don't break loudly. There's no dramatic explosion, no clear warning sign that something has gone wrong. Instead, it happens slowly, almost invisibly, beneath the surface. An empath can spend years absorbing the emotional weight of everyone around them, translating pain that isn't theirs, carrying burdens they never agreed to hold. And because they're wired to understand, to forgive, to rationalize behavior, they stay longer than they should. At first, it looks like strength. They're the calm one in chaos, the listener in every storm, the one who can sit with discomfort without flinching. But what most people don't realize is that this constant emotional processing comes at a cost. Every ignored boundary, every dismissed feeling, every moment where they chose someone else's peace over their own accumulates. Not all at once, but steadily, quietly. And here's where the shift begins. The empath starts to notice a pattern. They give, and it's expected. They understand, and it's exploited. They forgive, and it's repeated. What once felt like purpose begins to feel like depletion. The emotional bandwidth that used to feel endless starts narrowing. Conversations feel heavier. Interactions feel transactional. And for the first time, the empath doesn't just feel other people, they start feeling the weight of themselves. This is the internal conflict most never see, because externally, they still look composed. They still show up. They still listen. But internally, something is changing. There's a growing tension between who they've always been and what they're starting to realize. And that realization is simple, but unsettling. Being deeply understanding doesn't protect you from being deeply harmed. Now, psychologically, this is where overload turns into suppression. The empath doesn't suddenly lose their sensitivity, they start containing it. Instead of expressing hurt, they analyze it. Instead of reacting emotionally, they step back and observe. And while that might sound like growth, there's a critical difference between awareness and avoidance. Because what's happening here isn't healing, it's compression. Think of it like pressure building beneath the surface. Every unspoken frustration, every time they chose silence over confrontation, every moment they minimize their own needs, it doesn't disappear. It gets stored. And over time, that emotional storage reaches capacity. This is the breaking point. Not a loud one, not a visible one, but a decisive one. It's the moment where the empath stops asking, "How can I understand them?" and starts asking, "Why am I tolerating this?" That shift in question changes everything, because it redirects attention inward. It forces them to evaluate not just others' behavior, but their own patterns of acceptance. And here's where it becomes dangerous, not for others, but for the identity the empath has built around themselves. Because once they see it, they can't unsee it. They recognize the imbalance. They see where they've been overextending, overgiving, over-explaining. And with that awareness comes a kind of emotional recoil, a pulling back, a need to protect what's been unprotected for too long. But protection, when it's born from prolonged exposure to harm, doesn't always come out balanced. It often comes out extreme. The same depth that allowed them to love intensely now allows them to withdraw completely. The same awareness that helped them connect now helps them detach. And the same emotional intelligence that made them compassionate can begin to make them calculating, because they're no longer just feeling emotions, they're managing them. This is the moment people describe as dark, but it's not darkness in the way most think. It's not evil. It's not malicious. It's the result of an empath reaching a threshold where continuing as they were is no longer sustainable. So they adapt. They become more selective, more guarded, less reactive. And while on the surface it may look like they've become cold, what's actually happened is far more complex. They've stopped allowing unrestricted access to their emotional world. And for those who were used to benefiting from that openness, this shift feels unsettling, even threatening. But from the empath's perspective, it's survival. The terrifying part isn't that the empath changes. It's that the change was necessary. And once that necessity is understood, there's no going back to who they used to be. Because the moment an empath realizes that their greatest strength has also been their greatest vulnerability is the moment they stop giving it away so freely. What happens next is even more unsettling, because it's quieter and far more deliberate. After that internal breaking point, the empath doesn't announce a change. There's no confrontation, no dramatic declaration that something is different. In fact, to the outside world, it may look like nothing has changed at all. They're still present. still composed, still engaged in conversation, but if you pay close attention, there's a subtle shift in how they communicate. They stop explaining, and this is significant because explaining was once their default. Empaths naturally try to bridge gaps in understanding. They clarify intentions, soften conflicts, and translate emotions so that everyone else feels comfortable. They over-articulate not because they're unsure, but because they care. They want to be understood, and more importantly, they want others to feel understood. But over time, something becomes clear to them. Not everyone misunderstands you accidentally. Some people benefit from misunderstanding you. Some people rely on your explanations because it gives them room to avoid accountability. And once an empath recognizes that pattern, the value of explaining begins to collapse. So they stop. Not out of pettiness, not out of anger, but out of awareness. Instead of trying to correct every misinterpretation, they let people reveal themselves. Instead of rushing to fill silence, they allow it to stretch. And in that silence, something interesting happens. People start saying more than they intend to. Without guidance, without emotional cushioning, others expose their assumptions, their motives, and their limitations. This is where the empath transitions from participant to observer. Now, psychologically, this is a powerful shift because observation creates distance, and distance creates clarity. When you're no longer emotionally entangled in every interaction, you begin to see patterns you couldn't see before. You notice inconsistencies. You pick up on subtle manipulations. You recognize when someone's words don't align with their behavior. And for an empath, this realization is profound because their natural ability to read people doesn't disappear. It sharpens. But here's the key difference. They're no longer using that ability to connect. They're using it to evaluate. Every interaction becomes data. Every reaction is noted. They start asking quieter, more strategic questions. Is this person consistent? Do their actions match their words? What happens when I don't accommodate them? And perhaps most revealing of all, who are they when I stop making it easy for them? This is where the discomfort begins for others. Because the empath who once made conversations smooth, forgiving, and emotionally safe is no longer doing that work. They're no longer translating tension into understanding. They're allowing tension to exist. And most people don't know how to handle that. You'll see it in subtle ways. People become defensive. They ask, why are you being distant? Or what's wrong? But what they're really reacting to is the absence of something they relied on the empath's willingness to carry emotional weight for both sides. Now, there's a philosophical layer to this that's worth understanding. When an empath stops explaining, they're not just changing behavior, they're redefining responsibility. They're no longer taking ownership of how others interpret them. They're no longer overfunctioning to maintain harmony. Instead, they're allowing people to sit with their own perceptions, even if those perceptions are flawed. And that can feel harsh, especially coming from someone who was once endlessly accommodating. But it's not harsh, it's accurate, because true communication isn't about constant clarification. It's about mutual effort. And once the empath realizes that they've been carrying more than their share of that effort, the imbalance becomes impossible to ignore. So they recalibrate. They speak less, but with more precision. They engage, but with boundaries. They listen, but without immediately absorbing. And most importantly, they stop trying to control how they're perceived. This is where their silence becomes powerful. Not passive silence, not avoidance, but intentional restraint. The kind that forces others to reveal their character without interference. The kind that removes emotional shortcuts and exposes what's actually there. And this is why the shift feels so unsettling to those around them. Because the empath is no longer predictable. They're no longer easy to read, easy to access, or easy to influence. There's a new layer of distance, one that isn't built from indifference, but from discernment. They're still aware, still perceptive, still capable of deep understanding. They've just decided not to offer it automatically. And that decision changes the entire dynamic. Because when an empath stops explaining, they stop negotiating their worth in every interaction. They stop justifying their boundaries. They stop shrinking their clarity to fit someone else's comfort. They let their presence speak for itself. And the people who are only comfortable with the version of them that over-explained, overgave, and over-accommodated begin to fall away, not because the empath pushed them out, but because for the first time the empath stopped pulling them in. And that's the moment everything becomes clear. Silence isn't the absence of communication, it's the removal of distortion. And after that period of silence and observation, something even more profound begins to take shape, something that, for many people, is difficult to recognize at first, because it doesn't look dramatic. It doesn't look like anger. It doesn't look like conflict. It looks like nothing. This is the phase where the empath, who once felt everything so intensely, begins to feel less. Not because they've healed completely, and not because the world has suddenly become easier to navigate, but because their system has adapted. What you're witnessing here is not the loss of emotion, but the strategic reduction of exposure to it. At one point, their emotional range was expansive. They could walk into a room and sense tension before a word was spoken. They could pick up on subtle shifts in tone, body language, energy. They felt deeply, responded quickly, and often carried emotional residue long after the interaction had ended. But that level of sensitivity without boundaries is unsustainable. So the mind does what it's designed to do. It protects. And one of the most effective forms of protection is detachment. Now, detachment is often misunderstood. People assume it means coldness or a lack of care or even arrogance. But in reality, it's a recalibration. It's the nervous system recognizing that constant emotional immersion is not safe and adjusting accordingly. The empath doesn't stop understanding people. They stop internalizing them. And that distinction is critical, because externally they may appear the same. They can still listen, still respond, still engage in conversation. But internally, there's a boundary that didn't exist before. Emotions that once moved through them freely now meet resistance. Not suppression in the chaotic sense, but filtration. They begin to choose what they allow in, and with that choice comes a noticeable shift in behavior. They no longer react immediately. Situations that would have once triggered a strong emotional response are now met with pause, sometimes even indifference. They don't rush to fix. They don't rush to soothe. They don't rush to engage. They assess, and for the people around them, this can feel disorienting. Because the empath who once responded with warmth, urgency, and depth now responds with space, with stillness, with a kind of emotional neutrality that feels unfamiliar. You might hear phrases like, "You've changed," or "You don't care like you used to." But what's really being observed isn't the absence of carrots, the absence of overextension. This is where the psychological shift becomes more complex. Because detachment, when it's developed after prolonged emotional strain, doesn't always feel like relief. Sometimes it feels like emptiness. There's a quiet question that starts to surface. Why don't I feel the same way anymore? And that question can be unsettling, especially for someone whose identity was built around emotional depth. But here's the reality: they haven't lost their capacity to feel. They've lost their willingness to feel without limits. And that's a very different thing. Philosophically, this is a turning point, because it forces the empath to redefine what connection actually means. Is connection about absorbing everything someone else brings? Or is it about engaging without losing yourself in the process? For most of their life, the empath operated under the first definition. They believed that to truly understand someone, they had to feel what that person felt. They equated depth with immersion. But now, they begin to see the cost of that approach. They start to understand that constant emotional immersion blurs identity. It makes it difficult to distinguish between what is theirs and what belongs to someone else. And over time, that confusion leads to exhaustion, resentment, and eventually withdrawal. So they adjust. They remain aware, but no longer attached. They can recognize someone's pain without absorbing it. They can witness emotional intensity without matching it. They can be present without being consumed. And that's where their presence changes. It becomes quieter, more grounded, less reactive. There's a certain stillness to them, a sense that they're no longer being pulled in every direction by external emotional forces. To some, this feels intimidating, because when someone is no longer emotionally reactive, they become harder to influence. The usual methods, guilt, pressure, emotional urgency, don't have the same effect. The empath isn't responding from impulse anymore. They're responding from choice, and choice introduces control. But there's also a shadow side to this phase that needs to be acknowledged, because while detachment protects, it can also isolate. If taken too far, it can create distance, not just from harmful dynamics, but from meaningful ones as well. That's the tension the empath has to navigate. How to remain open without becoming vulnerable to harm. How to stay connected without losing autonomy. how to feel deeply without being overwhelmed by it. And there's no simple answer to that. It's a constant calibration. But what's undeniable is the empath who has reached this level of detachment is no longer operating from the same place they once were. They're no longer driven by the need to be needed, or the impulse to fix, or the habit of overgiving. They've stepped into a different mode of being, one that is less emotional on the surface, but far more intentional underneath. And for those who only understood them through their emotional availability, this version can feel unfamiliar, even unsettling. But it's not a loss. It's a refinement, because the empath hasn't stopped feeling. They've finally learned that not everything deserves to be felt. And once you reach this stage after the overload, the silence and the detachment, you arrive at something that is often misunderstood, even feared. Because from the outside, it can look like a complete transformation. But internally, it's not chaos. It's precision. The empath doesn't lose their ability to read people. If anything, it becomes sharper than ever. But now it's no longer automatic. It's intentional. At the beginning of their journey, their awareness was instinctive. They would walk into a room and immediately start processing who's uncomfortable, who's upset, who needs reassurance. Their attention moved outward, constantly scanning, constantly adjusting. It was almost reflexive, like breathing. Now that same awareness is still there, but it's directed differently. They're not asking, how can I help this person feel better? They're asking, what is actually happening here? And that shift from emotional reaction to analytical observation is where their power consolidates. They begin to see patterns with clarity, not just isolated behaviors, but consistent tendencies. They notice how someone responds under pressure, how they handle boundaries, how they speak about others when those people aren't present. They stop taking things at face value and start evaluating intent beneath expression. And because they've spent so much of their life immersed in emotional nuance, they're exceptionally good at it. This is where the term dark empath starts to surface, not because they've become malicious, but because they've become aware without being immediately compassionate. That distinction matters. Compassion in its purest form is open and giving, but when it's been exploited, it becomes selective. And selectivity introduces control. The empath no longer offers understanding freely, they allocate it based on what they observe. Now, this is where things can take two very different paths. On one path, this awareness becomes a tool for protection. The empath uses it to set boundaries, to avoid manipulation, to engage only where there is mutual respect. They become measured, intentional, disciplined in how they invest their energy. On the other path, that same awareness can become a tool for influence. Because when you understand what drives people, their insecurities, their desires, their patterns, you also understand how to affect them. You know what to say, what to withhold, when to engage, and when to remain silent. You understand timing. You understand leverage. And this is the part that unsettles people. Because the empath, who once seemed emotionally transparent, is now strategically reserved. There's a layer of unpredictability that wasn't there before. You can't easily read their intentions, because they're no longer expressing everything they feel in real time. They're choosing. And choice creates asymmetry. In most interactions, people operate on a mix of impulse and habit. They react quickly, often without full awareness of why they're responding the way they are. But the empath at this stage is no longer operating on impulse. They're observing first, deciding second, and responding last. That delay, that space between stimulus and responses where control exists. And once someone learns to operate from that space consistently, their presence changes. They become harder to manipulate, harder to pressure, harder to predict, not because they're closed off, but because they're no longer accessible in the same way. Now, philosophically, this raises an important question. What is the ethical responsibility of awareness? Because awareness by itself is neutral. It doesn't dictate behavior, it enables it. The same understanding that allows someone to connect deeply can also allow them to influence subtly. The same insight that builds trust can also exploit it. So the empath is faced with a decision. Do they use this clarity to protect and refine their relationships? Or do they use it to control outcomes in people? And that decision defines whether this transformation becomes constructive or destructive. But regardless of the path they choose, one thing is certain: the empath is no longer naive. They no longer assume good intent without evidence. They no longer ignore inconsistencies for the sake of harmony. They no longer give unlimited access to their emotional world. They've learned that empathy without boundaries isn't kindness, it's self-abandonment. So now their empathy is structured. It's deliberate. It's measured. It's offered where it's earned, not where it's demanded. And for those who were accustomed to the earlier version of them, the one who gave freely, explained endlessly, and absorbed everything, this version can feel intimidating because it removes the imbalance. It removes the unspoken advantage. It replaces emotional availability with emotional sovereignty. And sovereignty by its nature cannot be easily influenced. That's why this stage is often described as dark. Not because it's negative, but because it's no longer easily understood by those who benefited from the light. The empath hasn't lost their depth. They haven't lost their awareness. They haven't even lost their compassion. They've simply integrated it with discernment. And that combination is powerful. Because now they're not just someone who feels deeply. They're someone who chooses carefully. And that choice, consistent, intentional, and grounded, is what ultimately determines the direction of their transformation. Because the same awareness that can protect you can also define you. So the question becomes simple, but not easy. Now that you see clearly, what will you do with it?